I wonder if you would first discuss the plans for the new drug treatment centers that were announced yesterday. What were the criteria that were used in determining which centers would be funded? How many applications were received? How many met your criteria for award? And how many of those that met the criteria will actually be funded?
I'd like to ask Dr. Fauci if he would answer those questions.
Dr. Fauci, pull a microphone in front of you if you would.
The criteria for the awarding of the contracts for the 14 treatment evaluation units were the standard peer review criteria, whereby individuals representing the institutions in question submitted proposals in accordance with the requests for proposals for the contracts in question, in which they laid out a plan that they had for the design and implementation of the studies that would be directed towards the evaluation of a variety of therapies, both for the virus itself as well as for the opportunistic infections associated with the virus. These proposals were then submitted to peer review and were ranked according to the merit of individual proposals, and that is the standard way that they were chosen. There were 29 applications received. 19 of them received an approval. 14 of the 19 were funded. 10 did not meet approval and were not considered for funding.
And when did the funds for the treatment centers first become available to you?
The funds first became available with the 1986 supplemental budget, which was, we put out the RFP for that in November of 1985. The awarding, the contract acceptance of proposals was terminated in January or February of 1986, and the awards were made just yesterday.
Why did it take so long to just get to the point now of approving the grants for the centers? You heard Dr. Hirsch's testimony, and I think that's part of what he was commenting on, this long, complex process which he felt was unnecessarily drawn out.
No. Yeah, unfortunately, the situation is such that although it appears to be quite long, and in fact is quite long when one looks at the seriousness of the situation and trying as quickly as possible to get these contracts funded, in fact, by the very nature of the peer review system and the necessity to evaluate and fine-tune and revise proposal, I can tell you, although it does appear to be long, and in fact is long, it's probably one of the fastest pushing throughs of contract reviews and implementation that we've had at least in my memory.
Are each of the funded centers receiving the full amount that they had requested in their application?
There had been modifications, as is all the case with contract proposals, where there have been some not downgrading, where there have been less money allocated than had been originally requested because of the fine-tuning. The types of negotiations that go back and forth are very standard when you're dealing with contract proposals.
How much additional funding would you require to fund the additional 5 which had passed your criteria but were not able to be funded?
Well, if you just take the average, we ranged anywhere from $700,000 to $2 million per. We funded 14 for a total of $20 million for the first year and $100 million for 5 years. So if you could just use the mean 14 into 20, so there'd be approximately 1.4 or 5 million per. If you multiply that by 5, there would be an extra 7.5 to $10 million that would be required to fund the remaining that were approved.
And I assume that you're not suggesting, although you correct me if my assumption is incorrect, that in fact 14 is all that you need.
I think we clearly, as I have mentioned before in testimonies, it would be beneficial if we could, in a scientifically prudent and controlled way, get as many drugs tested in as many people as we can within the realm of the scientific study. So we would probably be able to use more than 14.
Right. Have you requested any more funds to open more centers or include more patients in the trials?
With regard to the fiscal year '86 and the negotiations that went around that proposal, no, we got the amount that we requested for that.
Do you anticipate funding any additional centers under the budget amendment now pending before Secretary Bowen?
That is conceivable. They will either be funding more or supplementing those that are existing to expand the number of patients that will be seen within centers. But it is also conceivable that we will be able to fund additional centers besides the ones that we are funding.
The $20 million that we're talking about that were involved in the authorization or granting to those 14 centers are from the fiscal '86 budget, the current budget, isn't
Yes,
that correct?
that's
Right.
correct.
Now, have you made a request for the additional money in your fiscal 1987 budget request?
Yes.
And how much did you ask for?
I think that is something that we're still in the process at the department level of negotiating with, sir.
You've indicated that just to averaging out, the funding for the additional 5 centers would be about $7.5 million. Is that correct?
Between 7.5 and 10.
10. Now, have you in fact asked for that 7.5 or $10 million?
That was part of additional money that was put in the request, yes, sir.
Now, how many patients will be involved in these trials at the 14 centers?
Approximately 1,000 within the next 6 months could be enrolled, depending upon the individual protocols, which will vary from center to center. Hopefully as many as 2,000 within a year or so, but within the first 6 months, we would estimate approximately 1,000.
And from which populations will the patient groups be chosen?
When you say populations, you mean types of disease?
Right.
Right. At first, there will be phase 1 and phase 2 studies in individuals with full-blown AIDS or individuals that fulfill the criteria, the empirical criteria of CDC. There will also be individuals who have the AIDS-related complex, and depending upon the preliminary results of individuals within those 2 categories, we plan to go on and also treat or do treatment evaluation in individuals who are asymptomatic carriers.
What role will the private drug companies play in clinical trials conducted by the new treatment evaluation units?
In several of them, the drug companies involved will supply the drug. In other protocols in which the drug is available through the NIH will supply the drug. Again, it varies from protocol to protocol, but there are clear instances in which the drug will be supplied by the drug company in question.
What consideration was given to geographic and patient concentration concerns in the grant process?
Yeah. Well, the geographic consideration essentially gets taken care of because when one evaluates the feasibility of doing the types of studies that are done according to these protocols, obviously one would need patients in addition to the scientific expertise to implement the study. So centers, for example, centers in which there was a significant number of patients to be able to adequately implement the study, that clearly argued as a positive for that particular group, although you did not have to be a city that had one of the top 1 or 2 numbers of patients in the country, but the availability of patients to study was necessarily something which went into the deliberations and the considerations for the awarding of the contract.
When and how will the specific plans or protocols be announced for each treatment evaluation unit?
Yeah. Again, they will be in various phases, Mr. Chairman. There are some protocols that are essentially already ongoing in which this amount of award would help them to implement it and supplement it so that some centers can actually just hit the ground running. Others, now that the award has been made, will be in active negotiations over the next month with the staff at the NIH in order to have input from both sides into the design of the protocol, and hopefully they'll begin to be implemented within a month or two, so that hopefully by the middle or end of the summer, we'll have most of the protocols rolling.
So that the actual trials will be beginning within the next month to 6 weeks?
Hopefully, some of them. I wouldn't say every one of them, Mr. Chairman, but clearly there'll be some of them that will be going within that time.
And what will be the criteria for patient access to these evaluation units?
Again, when you're dealing with a multifaceted situation, such as a disease that has, for example, groups of patients that have Kaposi sarcoma alone, or groups of patients that have opportunistic infection, patients that have severe versus moderate versus very slight immunological abnormalities, depending upon the question that a given protocol is asking, that will determine the access into a particular protocol. A very brief example of that: if one particular drug is looking at the effect of a particular agent on the progression or the remission, as it were, of Kaposi sarcoma, you'd like to have an individual in that protocol who is well enough to be able to evaluate, but has measurable Kaposi sarcoma lesions that you can actually follow in a scientifically sound way, whereas another protocol in which you wanted to determine whether a particular drug would decrease the frequency of opportunistic infections, you'd have a population of patients that have already had, for example, a bout of pneumocystis carinii pneumonia. If you're looking at children, you'd have a children protocol. So it's really a multifaceted system, and each protocol will be designed and directed towards a particular question at hand.
How will patients, physicians, individuals, and organizations interested in clinical drug trials obtain accurate and up-to-date information regarding the status of each experimental drug?
Group of individuals who have access to the data so that the code of a controlled study can be broken if, in fact, certain results look to be very good or very harmful before the end of the study. And this way you don't have undue time in doing a study in which you have your answer right away, nor do you allow a study to go on further than it should when it's obvious that there's significant toxicity. In addition to that, there's a clinical trials coordinating group which will have access to all the data in a database so that it will be easily able to be analyzed and made available so that one would know rather quickly the data as it becomes available.
Will there be any mechanism for the various treatment evaluation units to communicate with each other on new standards, results, and observations?
Yes, definitely. In fact, well, there are a number of ways to do that. First of all, with regard to the 14 centers involved initially in this study, there will be the principal investigators in each of these will frequently come to the NIH and vice versa to report on a frequent basis I would say the preliminary results of the trial. Also, there's a checks and balances system in which we have a data safety monitoring board, an independent group of individuals who have access to the data so that the code of a controlled study can be broken if, in fact, certain results look to be very good or very harmful before the end of the study. And this way you don't have undue time in doing a study in which you have your answer right away, nor do you allow a study to go on further than it should when it's obvious that there's significant toxicity. In addition to that, there's a clinical trials coordinating group which will have access to all the data in a database so that it will be easily able to be analyzed and made available so that one would know rather quickly the data as it becomes available.
Will there be any mechanism for the various treatment evaluation units to communicate with each other on new standards, results, and observations?
Yes, definitely. In fact, as part of the meetings that will be held of all of the principal investigators from these treatment evaluation units frequently coming to the NIH, which is something that will happen within this group of treatment evaluation units, and in some respects is very standard when you have groups of coordinating centers of frequent meetings to exchange scientific information and up-to-date data.
Is that mechanism in place at this point?
That mechanism, in fact, is in place in the sense that that is part of the entire infrastructure of the treatment evaluation units, is to come to the NIH frequently and meet with the staff at the NIH and to have regular meetings as a group.
Thank you very much, Mr. Levin.